Thank you. Good evening. I apologize for speaking in English. My German is not good enough, but since you were all forewarned, I assume your English is you will understand, and if not, my book is over there in German, so you can get it. And just introduction before I begin, Jakob reminded me that his invitation came many months ago before the tragedy of Halle and the potential even greater tragedy of it. And it reminded me, as I was sitting here, that when I finished my book, I finished the manuscript, I would say probably midsummer 2018, so just a little over a year ago. And I know there are many authors of books in this room. Usually when you finish a book, you send it off to your editor, and the editor makes changes, but this was the final send-off. And I got back from my editor, copy edited and her edits as well, what's called the author's last pass. In other words, it's the author's last chance to make corrections. But the assumption is that the corrections the author will make will be relatively minor corrections. Now is not the time, at this stage in the publication process, is not the time for adding great new information. And yet when I received the manuscript back, I would say beginning of August, there had been so many developments in the 6 weeks that the publisher had the book, that I called my editor and I said, I have to add things. There had been developments in Poland with the law about Holocaust collaboration. There have been developments in Hungary. There have been developments in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, and there continue to be developments, et cetera. So I added, she said, I understand, add it, but we must have it by the beginning of September. So I added, and one day I received a phone call from my editor who said, Deborah, we have to have the book within 48 hours because it's got to go into production, it's in the catalog, etc. So the last paragraph I wrote in the book was, I'm a historian, and historians are not designed to predict. Because we know the past doesn't mean we will know what the future brings. We may understand how the past relates to the contemporary situation. I said, but I'm willing to predict that by the time this book appears, something will have happened that should have been included. And 6 weeks later came the tragedy in Pittsburgh, the greatest massacre of Jews any time in the United States. And so too, you invited me, I guess, last winter, and we agreed upon it and arranged it and everything, and then came Halle. So when I first started to write this book, people said to me, a book on anti-Semitism, do we really need it? By the time the book came out, nobody asked me that. And the question I get now is, when are you doing an updated version? And the book has been out for 9 months. I begin with a joke. Yes, it's a lecture about anti-Semitism, but we Jews know how to laugh at many things, including that. We do know irony, no matter what Jeremy Corbyn may say. And this is a joke that I heard in the Soviet Union when I visited the late unlamented Soviet Union in 1972. I was meeting refuseniks. Refuseniks, as many of you know, many may come from or have been Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union and should have been allowed to under Soviet law, but were refused permission to leave, either to go to Israel, come here, go to America, whatever it was. So I was visiting refuseniks. It was around the time of Rosh Hashanah, so in the fall. And at one point, we were walking I was walking in the street with two very prominent refuseniks, and we had a car going along with us. It was clearly a KGB car. And it wasn't that we were so smart to discern the car, but the KGB officer in the car wanted us, the refusenik, to know, I know you have visitors from abroad and I am following you. It was to make us uncomfortable. And I said to him, you do not seem to be bothered by this at all. He said, we're used to it, we deal with it, we laugh about it. So I said, well, tell me how exactly you laugh about it. And he told me the following joke. Word goes out in Moscow that a store is going to get a shipment of shoes. And those of you who may remember those days or know of them from parents or whatever know that consumer goods were in very short supply, if at all, in the Soviet Union. You'd go past windows, and in the display in the window of the store, there'd be a couple of items covered with dust because it was never changed. And if you wanted one of the items that was in the window and you went inside, they didn't have it. So word goes out that the store is going to get a shipment of shoes. It's January, it's freezing cold, and people line up from the night before. By the time morning comes, there's already a line around the block, and it continues to grow. The store doesn't open. Finally, 2 hours after the store is supposed to open, the manager comes out and says, we are not going to have enough shoes for everybody online. All the Jews go home. Jews are not getting shoes. No shoes for Jews. So the Jews leave the line. About 2 hours later, everyone is even colder. We're not going to have enough shoes for everyone. All non-party members go home. So the non-party. All non-veterans of the Great War go home. And so it went through the day till at the end of the day, 5, 6 o'clock, it's dark, it's cold. People have been online since the night before. The manager, and all that's left online are veterans, wounded veterans of the Great War of World War II, who have, all their medals, etc. The manager comes out and says, we're not going to get any shoes today, everybody go home. So as 2 of these veterans were walking away from the store, angry, upset, one says to the other, those Jews, they have all the luck. It's an illustration of course, the illogical nature of anti-Semitism. Another joke, this will be the only 2 jokes, don't worry, it's not a comedy routine, is a joke that was supposedly, I doubt that it really was, but supposedly was told by German Jews during the 1930s. That a Nazi official comes to a gathering and in a harangue talks about the Jews are a misfortune, the Jews do this, the Jews do that. And finally, a voice from the crowd in the corner yells out, and the bicycle riders. So he looks up, he says, why the bicycle riders? And the voice says, why the Jews? In other words, there is no logical reason when you ask the question, why anti-Semitism? In a way, you're already lost because you're asking for a logical answer to an illogical phenomenon. Anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice. Think of the etymology of the word prejudice, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. And it can apply to any minority group. I see a black person, I know their characteristics simply because they're black. I see a gay person, I know their characteristics simply because they're gay. I see a woman in a hijab, I know her characteristics simply because of her head covering. And I see a Jew, I've made up my mind. It doesn't matter who the person is, what their values are, I've made up my mind. But yet, despite its illogical nature, we look today for some sort of definition. That's one of the things that I find people, help me understand what it is. There was a famous, one of the most famous lines to come out of the American Supreme Court was in a case in the 60s, the early 60s, about a film by Louis Malle. And the debate was whether the film was pornographic or not. And one of the justices, a man named Justice Potter Stewart, wrote in his dissent, he didn't believe that the film was pornographic. He wrote, I cannot define pornography, but I know it when I see it, and this is not pornographic. So often some people say about anti-Semitism, particularly Jews, I can't quite define it, but I know it when I see it. But we can do better than that. Isaiah Berlin is credited, I don't know if he was the one who originally said it, someone has told me now it comes from a Hungarian novel, but I'm not sure, but that an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary. Now, that sounds amusing, but actually it's a very good definition. Because if I hate you because you are an awful person, or I think you're an awful person, that's one thing. But if I hate you one iota more because you are black, or because you are Jewish, or because you're a gay, that's prejudice. Or if I attribute what you've done, or the reasons, even if you've done nothing, the reasons for my animosity towards you, then it's prejudice, and in the case of the Jews, it's anti-Semitic. But we can actually do better than that. There is a template for anti-Semitism. You look for certain things and you can recognize the anti-Semitic canards, the anti-Semitic memes, stereotypes. And usually 3 items. Something to do with money, something to do with smarts, being smart, but not smart in a positive way. Smart in a malicious, smart in a cunning fashion, and something to do with power, the ability to punch above your weight. Small group, but yet they exert a power above their number in the society. Now, where does this come from? I find the source, there's some historians who go further back, but to my mind, some go back to Alexandria, etc. But to my mind, it really has its source in the New Testament story of the death of the crucifixion of Jesus. And I apologize if there are any Bible scholars here or people who are very familiar with this. I'm sort of grouping a number of versions of the story into one. But the basic theme of the story is that the Jews, everybody in the story is Jewish, of course. Jesus is Jewish, the Jews are Jewish, the priests are Jewish, except the Romans who actually kill him. But that's a historical fact. We're not dealing with historical fact. The way the story is told, the Jews wanted Jesus killed. Why? Because he wanted to chase the money changers from the temple. So there you have the finance, money. They went to the Romans, the most powerful entity in the world at the time. So it wasn't just a small group of non-entities who happened to be in control of Judea, but the Romans. They go to the Romans and they say, kill him. And the Romans don't want to do it. But the Jews have the smarts, the cunning, to convince the Romans to do this, and the power to get them, the smarts and the power to get them to do this. And that becomes the template. Didn't have to be the template. Didn't have to be treated that way. But over the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, church fathers, mainly fathers, there were some church mothers, but it's mainly church fathers, used this story to denigrate Jews, to justify ill treatment of Jews, to differentiate Christians from Jews. And another element is added over the course of centuries. There is, in fact, a very fine book on this by Trachtenberg. The Jews become the demon. The Jews become the devil. And of course, if you know in Christian theology, the devil or the demon has 2 characteristics. One is that the devil or the demon is the only one capable of harming God. Of course, these are the people who killed Jesus, again, forgetting the facts. And the devil or the demon is able to disguise himself so that he comes and does his handiwork without your recognizing that he's been there. You don't know you've encountered the devil or the demon till after he's come and gone. And here I'll draw on something that I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. One of the charges, the anti-Semitic charges of the National Socialists, we saw this in the propaganda films, Goebbels, et cetera, in the films that he made and in the statements and the speeches, was that the Jew who can't be recognized as the Jew is more dangerous than the Jew you can recognize as the Jew. So the famous scene from one of Goebbels' films where you start out with a Jew with side curls and a big beard and a kippah and a long black coat, and the next scene the side curls are gone, the beard is gone, it's replaced with a suit, and saying, of course, this Jew is much more dangerous than the Jew you can recognize. The next scene in the movie, this is Hitler's famous documentary, anti-Semitic documentary, Fritz Hitler, is of Jews sitting around. I think it said, he may say it's Berlin, maybe he doesn't say it, but in evening dress, women in gowns, sipping champagne, smoking cigars, and the implication being, these are the more dangerous Jews, because these are like the devil. You can't immediately recognize them as Jews. But I don't want to suggest that this is simply a Christian phenomenon. It may begin there, but it moves quickly outside of it. In the 17th century, Voltaire, not a friend of the church, not a fan of the church, when he writes about the Jews, it's as if he could be a church father. Or you can go outside the church. Karl Marx, not a fan of any religion, when he writes about the Jews, it sounds exactly the same as when it's coming from a religious source. Or into the science of eugenics, you get the same kind of comments. The National Socialists, of course. Even Holocaust deniers, something with which I am quite familiar. If you were to have the poor luck to sit down on an airplane next to a Holocaust denier, and you're a friendly person, I never talk to anybody in the next seat to me until we're about to land, because, they could be, as we'd say in Yiddish, a real nudnik, and I don't need that. But let's say you sat down next to a denier, David Irving, and you say, what do you do? Oh, I write about the Holocaust. Oh, terrible. It was a terrible, terrible thing. Madam, you'd be glad to know it didn't really happen. That's what he said. That's what he said to a woman who was a survivor whose mother had died in Auschwitz. During my trial, she came up to him. He said, oh, you'll be happy to know she probably died of typhus and not in a gas chamber. So, but you listen to his harangue about why it didn't happen. You don't know that the documents he's quoting from you, he's manipulating, twisting, lying about. The natural question to ask him that you would have would be to say, but why? Why would the Jews make up this story? What do they have to gain for it? What's in it for them? And the answer you will get from a denier is, what did the Jews, and I put this in quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust? And the answer often given is Israel, even though there probably would have been some entity, we already know in the 30s, without the Holocaust. But the general impression is that it's Israel. And what else did the Jews get out of the Holocaust? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. And so right there, you have an explanation which fits right into the anti-Semitic template that I laid out for you earlier. The Jews were cunning enough to make up this story, powerful enough to get the Allies, not just the Allies to go along with it, but to get the German government to go along with it. And admit to something they didn't do, because they were powerful enough to say to the Germans, if you want to be accepted back into the family of nations, you have to admit to this crime. They got them to hold the Nuremberg trials, the other war crimes trials. It is built on the idea of a power that beggars all kinds of logic, and yet to the person hearing it who has been exposed to anti-Semitism, and you can't live in the Western world and not have been exposed to it, and it's not just the Western world, but certainly the Western world, it makes a certain sense because it fits with the stereotype. Today we see, to speak now more about the contemporary period, today we see anti-Semitism on both the right and the left. Hala, on the right, Hala, Pittsburgh, San Diego, Poway, and so many other places which have been stopped only because of good police work. The theory that motivates those people on the extreme right, the theory that motivated the man in Hala, and by the way, there's no more a concept of lone wolf. You know, you used to say, oh, he's a lone wolf. He just doing it. He's a crazy man and he does it. The internet has made the concept of lone wolf an anachronism. The killer in Poway, the killer in Poway is in the San Diego, the killer in Pittsburgh, even the killer in Christchurch who attacked the two mosques, and the one in Hala were all quoting the same people and citing the same sources. Doesn't mean they ever met. Doesn't mean they were in concert one with the other, but they're all citing the same sources and motivated by the same people. The theory on the far right, such as the killer in Hala, is what we call white genocide or white Christian replacement theory. The theory being that Europe is seeing an influx of black people, brown people, Muslims. America is seeing it coming from the south of the border. And this is not by chance. This is part of a program to flood Christian societies, white Christian, to displace white Christians and to replace them with people of color, people of a different religion. But, says the person who engages in this, or who spreads and believes in this white Christian replacement theory, these black people, these brown people, these Muslims, they're not smart enough to do this on their own. They're not capable of arranging this on their own. There is someone behind them. There is someone organizing it, and it is the Jew. And that's why in Charlottesville, the marchers were crying not just blood and soil, Blut und Boden, but also Jews will not replace us. What did they mean by that? Exactly this. The killer in Pittsburgh, as he was being brought down by the SWAT team, was yelling, you the people, you Jews will not destroy the white race. The killer in San Diego was saying the same thing. So that this is all part of, it's a crazy, it of course makes no sense. And when President Trump says, oh, those people, those brown people coming, he doesn't call them brown people, he calls them a swarm infestation, which is of course language that evokes the Third Reich. When he said, oh, they're being supported by George Soros. Or Orban says George Soros. Soros has become the 21st century Rothschild in terms of a figure. You don't have to agree with Soros on his economic policy, even his politics, but he is used as a stand-in for the Jew, or sometimes they will say the Jew directly. So what you have in that white replacement theory is, you see, and when I said that anti-Semitism is a prejudice, like racism, like so many other prejudices, it also has its unique characteristics, some of which I've described, but let me pull them out for you. The racist punches down. The racist looks at the brown person, the black person, and says, if they move into our neighborhood, they will bring down the neighborhood. If their children go to my children's school, they will ruin the school because they are lesser than us. The Nazi press described Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf and the other African Americans on the 1936 Olympic team as auxiliaries. They weren't really part of the real team. They were, subsidiary members. They were lesser than. The anti-Semite, who was often just the racist, another turned around, punches up. The Jew is not just to be loathed, as you might loathe the black person and the brown person, but the Jew is to be feared, because the Jew has these unique abilities, punching above their weight, their intellect, their financial power. So that anti-Semitism, while a prejudice, has unique elements that make it different from most of the other prejudices. It comes from the right, which is where most, and from the left, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it also has this conspiracy element that you're punching up. You just don't hate the Jew, you loathe the Jew, you fear the Jew because of their power. They become like the devil, the demon in contemporary terms. On the progressive left, and it's not everyone on the progressive left, but certainly if you look at those Jeremy Corbyn and those people around him, you see classic examples, and it's not just in the UK, it's in the United States and in other countries as well. Their view, the view on the progressive left, is of prejudice, is refracted through a prism, and you remember prisms bend light, shape light, which has a number of different facets. One facet is ethnicity, and one facet is class, and one facet is power. And they look upon the Jew and they see a white person, which of course is ironic, because as I've just described, those on the far right look at the Jew and don't see someone who is white. But they look upon the Jew and they see a white person. They look upon the Jew and they see a privileged person, even though we know many Jews are not privileged, but that doesn't matter. And they say, because you are white and because you are privileged, ipso facto, you have power. And because you have power, you cannot possibly be a victim of prejudice. And then there's another element that's added. We see this classically with Corbyn and again in the United States and with some members of the House of Representatives. And I call it it's somewhat funny, but it's the Miss Piggy defense. I remember Miss Piggy, moi, me. Jeremy Corbyn will always tell you that his mother demonstrated at Cable Street in the anti-Mosley demonstrations, the anti-fascist demonstration. Why does he always bring that up? Because what he's telling you is, I absorbed anti-prejudice, contempt for prejudice, contempt for fascism, literally with my mother's milk. It's impossible. It's oxymoronic to think that I could possibly be a purveyor of prejudice. So if you, the Jew, could not possibly be a victim because you have power and you're privileged and you're white, and I could not possibly be a perpetrator of prejudice, therefore, when you claim anti-Semitism, you must have ulterior motives. You want to bring down the party politically. You want to cover up for Israel, even if the item has nothing to do with Israel. Whatever it might be, you're not to be taken seriously. So that one of the problems, of course, is this not only not taking anti-Semitism on the left, not only not taking it seriously, but turning it around and saying, you, the Jew, you're making this up. You have an ulterior purpose. And it goes back again to the template we were talking about earlier. And of course, there are Islamist extremists, another source of anti-Semitism. And there is, and you know it here in Germany, it's been described to me as parallel societies. In sectors, and I want to be very careful here, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but we do know that in sectors of Muslim communities, some new arrivals, some not new arrivals, that there is a contemptuous attitude taught, inculcated, whether it comes from some imams, whether it comes from publications or whatever, towards Jews, and an anti-Semitic attitude, some of which may never lead to violence, but some of which may. Now, in terms of a typology, one might call it, of anti-Semites, there are different kinds. Now, the most dangerous, the extremists, the killer in Halle, the killers at the Brussels Jewish Museum of 4 or 5 years ago, Pittsburgh, Poway, so many in the Hyper Kasher, the kosher supermarket that was at the same time as the Charlie Hebdo murders. Those are extremists, and they're easy to recognize. And but for the terrible damage they do, which often includes killing people, they are the simplest case to deal with because we can recognize them. But there are others as well. There is also what I describe in my book as the dinner party, or it's called, the German edition we call the Salon anti-Semite. The person who would never think of doing anything, taking any anti-Semitic action, but who might say, we just hired a new young associate in our firm. He's Jewish, but he's very honest. In the but, you have the answer. I remember once as a child going into a store with my father, and my father was, a Yek, a German Jew, didn't wear a kippah on the street, wore a hat, because that's what you wore. But he was buying something, I think, to build our sukkah or something for the synagogue, so it was a hardware store. The man knew he was Jewish. He said, "Oh, Mr. Lipstadt, some of my best friends are Jews." And afterwards, I said to my father, I said, "Oh, that's nice, some of his best friends are Jews." And he said something which I didn't understand then, but I understand now. He said, "You'll never hear someone boast, some of my best friends are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants." The minute you're boasting, some of my best friends are Jews, some of my best friends are black, some of my best friends are gays, you're saying, "Look at me, I'm so terrific, I'm friendly," or "I'm friendly with the good ones, not the others." The minute you're boasting about it, run for the exits. But there are also other kinds. There are kinds that I described in your local newspaper, in the article that appeared this morning, and the Kochlöffel, those who stir up the pot, who might themselves not even be anti-Semites. And here I'm going to talk about the president of my country, who I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I think he's very proud of his Jewish daughter and Jewish son-in-law, his Jewish grandchildren who are getting serious Jewish education, etc. But he stirs things up. He stirs things up with a motive. When you talk about nice people on both sides, as he did after Charlottesville, nice people do not march through the street chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Nice people do not march through the street chanting "blood and soil," Blut und Boden. Nice people don't go to those kind of rallies. When he is supported by David Duke, he claims, "Oh, I don't know who David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan, I don't know who he really is," even though he's often talked about him. And all those on the far right hear what we call a dog whistle, a whistle that only a dog can hear because it's got a certain pitch. They feel they're hearing a signal. He's not telling us go out and do this, but that's the dog whistle that we are hearing. And you see it on the left, again, using, just because he's the most prominent that we know about, Jeremy Corbyn and those around him. Again, whether they are anti-Semite, asking whether a person is an anti-Semite or not is a useless task. It's like trying to push the rock up the hill. That what's in their heart is between them and their cardiologist. I don't know. It's what they do. I don't care what a person believes. I want to know what they do. Of course, if I know someone believes that blacks are inferior, that Jews are the devil or the dangerous or low, of course I don't want them as a friend or as an acquaintance or whatever. But ultimately, what's important is what they do. And then, of course, there are those who might be called clueless anti-Semites. And clueless by that, I mean, they don't quite even know what they're saying or what they're doing. And on some level, here is the indication of how bad the situation is. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine went to graduate school, to nursing school, and she lived she went to school in New York at Columbia, and in her class she came close with a group of women, this is quite many years ago, from the Midwest, from the middle of the United States, some from smaller towns, some larger towns, but none of them had ever really encountered Jews, worked with Jews, knew Jews personally. My friend came from a very hospitable family, and this family, modern Orthodox family, would invite my friend, and of course her friend, this is their daughter, but with her classmates, this small group of fellow students at the school, to come. And if you're a modern Orthodox family, when do you invite? Friday night. They would invite them, come for Shabbat dinner, come for the Seder, come for Purim, whatever it was. They loved being there. They loved being part of it. This was a new encounter for them, and they felt very much welcomed and very much at home. Fast forward to the end of the, right before graduation, right before completion of their program, and they're sitting around having a celebratory lunch together, and the women the women from the Midwest, all of whom are leaving to go back to their various towns, are talking about what they're going to miss in New York. And one of them says, oh, I'm going to miss the stores. You can get such bargains in this city. You can save so much money and find such great buys. And she says, I've just discovered a new store which has really terrific bargains. And she turns to my friend, the only Jew at the table, and says, you're really going to be interested in this. Now, this is coming from someone who has been, exposed to all this. And my friend, who's very quick, usually you think of a retort, of an answer in the middle of the night. You sit up at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, that's what I should have said, but the moment is past. She said, I didn't know Jews were the only ones smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money. And the woman got it. I'm not describing this woman who made this statement. I don't think she was an anti-Semite at all. But the perception of the Jew, that negative perception, had so sunk into the roots of society that it is accepted as a given. Time is late, so let me just add one more element before I close. What about Israel? Because that, of course, is often the big issue. I think that there's something that and almost doesn't need to be said, but it needs to be said. And that, of course, is that criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitism. I'm very critical of, and many of people I know, critical of American policies. I know that people here are critical of German policies. That doesn't make you anti-German, doesn't make you anti-American. But one has to, in fact, if you want to see criticism of Israeli policies, read Haaretz. Or go to the Knesset. You have to know Hebrew, or get someone to translate for you, and you'll hear criticisms of the policies. But it's when there is a myopic, a blinded view of Israel as the only aggressor, the only one who is wrong, the only one who is responsible for the situation. And again, you can disagree with the policies. Or you see only this tragedy. I was struck in recent weeks how on the left there's been such silence, certainly in the United States, certainly in North America, certainly in England, about the Kurds. A terrible tragedy. Now, I'm not saying that there's one tragedy that makes it right for another tragedy. I'm just saying, where is the outrage? Where is the focus? I recently had an encounter. I was at a meeting. They were talking, and afterwards there was a little bit of reception. And someone there who was a big supporter of boycotting Israel and exceptionally hostile to Israel said to me, he didn't know who I was. Lucky him. And he said something to the effect of, Israel was born in sin. Therefore, it doesn't have a right to exist. So I asked him what that meant. And he said, well, the Israelis chased out the Palestinian Arabs in 1948, which is not entirely true. Many left of their own accord. Many left because they were urged to do so by radio and broadcasts and imams from Syria, from Jordan, from Egypt. But there were places, there were towns, there were villages where Jewish fighting forces did push Arabs out. How many and what's more, and that's for another conversation. But he said to me, well, you see, even if you say, admit it, so it's founded in sin, it doesn't have a right, therefore, to exist. I said, let's contextualize this historically. We were in the United States. I said, let's think about other countries that have sins in their founding history. And let's start with the United States of America and slavery and our treatment of Native Americans. Or let's go to Canada and treatment of the indigenous people called in Canada the First Nation. Or let's Australia and the treatment of the Aborigines. Or New Zealand and the treatment of Maoris. I wasn't suggesting that that makes it all right. Not at all. But I was suggesting that when there is a singular focus like that, almost an obsession, you have to ask why? What is going on here? What then can we do? And with this, I want to close. I think we have to become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party. In this, you know, sometimes you'll come to a dinner party and your host or your hostess will say to you, there's someone here, he's an anti-Semite, he's a homophobe, he's hates Muslims, whatever it might be. Let's have a nice party, just ignore it. In this day and age, with what is going on in the world today, we can't be quiet. Not so much because you're going to convince that person. I don't debate deniers. I don't try to convince deniers, because anybody who can believe there wasn't a Holocaust, with the thousands of millions of pages of documentation, with the fact that for the deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Survivors would have to be wrong. Bystanders who lived in the towns, whether in Poland or the Russian front, and saw the killings and saw the people being marched out to be shot, or trains going into the camps. Thousands of historians would have to either be in on the trick, or the dupe being duped, or have been duped themselves, tricked themselves. Most of all, the perpetrators. In not one war crimes trial did a perpetrator, German, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, it doesn't matter, ever say it didn't happen. Said, I didn't do it, I was forced, I had no choice, all of which are fairly weak excuses, but never it didn't happen. So I'm not going to try to change their minds, but the people I worry about at the dinner party, I wouldn't try to change the mind of the person who's engaging in the anti-Semitism, but the other people sitting, not only the young people, but especially the young people, that this kind of talk is unacceptable. That's one thing. I think the other thing we have to do is recognize that you can't be against one ism and not be against other isms. That what starts with the Jews will end with others, or vice versa. We also have to take it seriously. And this is particularly for those on the left, where, as I described in the Labour Party, it's not taken seriously. Finally, the UN recently released a special rapporteur, which means he reports to the Secretary General, a very fine report on anti-Semitism. It's the first time ever, and taking it very seriously. And most of all, we have to remember, and I'm bringing coals to Newcastle to say this in Germany to an audience of Germans, but that it always starts with words. Whether you're talking about the Shoah, whether you're talking about the Armenian genocide, whether you're talking about Rwanda with the radio broadcasts from the Congo, certainly with the National Socialists, it starts with words. Now, not everybody who hears the words will ultimately become a genocideer, will engage in genocide, but everyone who becomes a genocideer heard the words to begin with. And finally, I think the danger of anti-Semitism, and again, I'm telling people who know this, who should know this well, yes, it's a threat to Jews. Of course it's a threat to Jews. The people in Halle saved by a bolt, and of course the two bystanders killed outside. But that's not even the main reason to be frightened by anti-Semitism, or that you have friends who are Jews or acquaintances who are Jews. It's good reasons, but it's not the main reason. The real reason is that anti-Semitism, as a conspiracy theory, as a hatred, is a threat to democracy. It's a threat to the multifaceted, multicultural societies which we so treasure. So it is a warning light. It is a warning light. And again, probably superfluous for me to say this here, but I think it's something that we have to remember and consider and take very seriously. Thank you very much.